Today is the uh probably close to the 1 year anniversary of dotChurch. Uh and if you saw the post online, I'm going to answer the question of why I have chosen to not take a salary as a pastor. I recently made a big transition off of a church staff and actually started working for a tech company. And so now I'm leading dotChurch in the same capacity as everyone else who helps leading with dotChurch, which means as a volunteer. And this was a huge shift for me. I've actually only had one other non-church related job in my whole life, and it was when I was 15 years old and I worked serving food in a retirement home. But other than that, I've spent the last 13 years or so working in churches. And I want to tell you all how I got here. And in the process, I'm hoping to answer a lot of questions that I've heard people ask about dotChurch in general, because a lot of people ask this main question. They say, what is dotChurch? And it's a fair question because it doesn't really fit neatly or nicely into any of the normal categories related to churches. Is it a ministry of a larger church? Is it a church all of its own? Is it an interactive podcast? Is it an online community? Is it a little bit of all of these things? Tonight, I'm hoping to answer this question, and I'm hoping to give a little bit of my vision of what dotChurch is currently and what I believe that it can be. Also, like Emma said, it's around the 1 year anniversary of dotChurch, which is just amazing in my opinion, especially since we have some people on here who have been a part of dotChurch since the very beginning. And I would love if you could do something fun for me in the chat. If you could just put in the chat, if you were here in the YA days of dotChurch, if you remember when dotChurch was called YA, put it in the chat really quick. Who on here remembers those days? Mike Spangler, James, Deb, Annie, Dominic, Sabrina. These are all OGs. So Emma, Vince Pieri, all sorts of people. So it's been great. And I'm just so thankful for the people who have stuck it out through so many different iterations of dotChurch. So a brief bit of history. I first became a pastor at a church in downtown Chicago. My wife and I, we were there for about 4.5 years, and then we moved out to the suburbs to be closer to her job. And so I got hired on as a pastor at my home church, which is actually the place where me and my wife met back in high school. And yes, we did meet and start dating in youth group. I always tell high schoolers that their boyfriend or girlfriend might really be the one. And literally every youth pastor hates me for saying that because they're very anti-dating in the youth group settings, but we're the exception maybe. But so I came on staff at this church as a worship pastor after being in the city. And that's like the guy who leads the music on Sunday mornings, for those of you who don't know all the inner church vernacular. And I also came on staff to help launch a young adults ministry at the church. The church was doing a great job of reaching people up to high school age, and then they didn't really have anything for anyone until they got married and had kids and maybe moved back from where they were somewhere else. So college age, 20s, early 30s, that didn't really have a great, strong ministry. So it seemed like there was a spot where we could help people. And so I started working there at the church in February of 2020, which was a month before the pandemic started. And so once everything shut down, our entire staff, we all had to pivot, which is a terrible, terrible word. Pivot is completely overused. And we worked really hard to start live streaming our Sunday morning services. And eventually we got the service up and running, and the live stream was doing a pretty good job of representing like what normally would have been happening in the room if you were there. But there was still something missing. And if you were a part of a church that had to close their doors at the beginning of the pandemic, and if you tried watching the live stream at home with your friends and your family, you probably very quickly realized this is just not going to cut it, because I don't care how cool your church is or how amazing the speakers are, sitting in your living room and trying to sing out loud with the TV, it's just not the same as being there in person. No matter how many churches pushed that vision, it just wasn't a replacement for church as we knew it. And so me and some of the other people started thinking about doing something different, something online, because we were trying to take COVID seriously, but something a little bit more interactive and engaging. And so me, Emma, who you just heard, my brother Frank, and a few other people, we started hosting an online Zoom small group every Tuesday night. And we called it YA, which we sometimes pronounced as yeah. Some of the people pronounce it that way. And it stood for young adults. And so that was really how dotChurch was born, even though it looked completely different in virtually every way except that we were in Zoom, like completely different than it does now. And so in that process, launching this online small group and iterating and changing, we discovered that this online format is actually really good at facilitating discussions. and that we would actually be able to get on some pretty great guests who were like experts in their fields without really too much trouble. But then we also started to realize that dotChurch was actually speaking to a really prevalent need that we weren't fully aware of at the beginning. A lot of the people who came on dotChurch were people who had been burned by the church, or people who were in a season of deconstruction. These types of people had no interest in going back to a physical church. The pandemic gave them like the best possible excuse to cut ties with their existing churches. Many of them had been thinking about leaving for a long time, but never felt like the timing was right. But then a global pandemic shuts down every church service in America, and it seems like as clear a sign as any from God to, cut the umbilical cord. And so the more that I talked with the people who were coming on dotChurch, the more I found myself relating with their criticisms of the church, because a ton of these issues were things that I myself had been wrestling with for years. There's a saying about, like seeing how the sausage is made. And it's 100% true. I've worked for so many different churches over the last 15 years. Big churches, small churches, churches with their own buildings, churches that had to set up in temporary spaces. And so I have seen how the sausage is made. And in many cases, it's not very pretty behind the scenes. And so I've been watching this stuff happen and had been very upset about these things, just as you had been too. All the ways that the church continues to miss the mark. And so I worked from the context of these churches pretty hard. I tried to change these things from the inside. But a lot of times it's easier said than done. Here's the reality that hardly anyone realizes. When we criticize the church or talk bad about it, a lot of time what you don't realize is that the pastors, way more of them than you might think, they actually are just as mad about the things you're mad about. A lot of them hate the way that the church is run like a business. They hate how money-driven and numbers-driven so many churches are. They hate how there isn't really a diversity of thought among the staff members and congregants. A lot of them have different ideas about the Bible and theology that they don't really feel comfortable sharing. Obviously, some pastors don't feel this way. Some really like the way the churches are. But by and large, pastors have a lot of views that don't always align with the majority. But in many cases, they're actually unable to express them. Because here's what's going on. Here's the problem. As churches grow and they scale, they need people in the church to start giving. But different people have different incomes. And so they end up giving different amounts of money. And so what ends up happening is that there's a few people, usually in most churches, with massive amounts of money who end up becoming huge givers at the church. And unfortunately, a lot of these people end up using their money to gain control. They can end up setting the agenda by making it virtually impossible for pastors to deviate in any way from whatever their vision of the church. And if the pastor starts speaking too openly about issues, let's say like related to race or something, the person can threaten to stop giving. And so as much as the pastor wants to talk about these things, wrestle through them, the structure that's in place makes it almost impossible. Because they ask themselves, is any issue important enough to risk the entire church closing down? Especially when the church is maybe doing so much good for so many people. It's a lot easier to keep the status quo than to fight for justice when your attendees pay your salary that you use to support your family, and not to mention all the salaries of all the other staff members. But this isn't actually the only issue when the pastor is relying on the attendees giving for their own livelihood. I think that this also is part of the reason that a lot of these pastors end up having these massive moral failings. What you have to understand is when your job is on the line, you're not going to ask for help when you begin to struggle. There's not really much room for error, to be open and honest about whatever you're struggling with. What you may not know is that big moral failures of pastors or whoever, they don't just happen like this. They happen over time. They're like slow builds. They start with something relatively innocent, and then they escalate over time. But in a structure where the church pays your salary, you can't just come clean and start asking for help when things start to go wrong. So pastors will sweep things under the rug and ignore them. And over time, the sins keep building, and then they really can't tell anyone. And I've watched this happen multiple times over the years. I've watched pastors who do reach out early on, like they struggled with something, maybe sexual related or money related or whatever. And they'll say, I'm starting to go down this path. And many of them will literally lose their jobs because of it. Churches will say, listen, we want you to stay in the church. We want you to get healed, but we're not going to pay you. And after you go through, a year of counseling or 2 years of counseling, then we'll talk about giving you your job back. But who can do that? Who can stay in the church like that when now they don't have a way to feed their families? So usually they end up looking for another church that will take them in spite of whatever that failing was. And then the church, that takes them in, who's fine with whatever that moral failing was, will probably keep it under the rug. And then the cycle gets perpetuated. And so I'm looking at all these problems and I'm wrestling through them. And I started thinking to myself, what would it look like to just not take a salary from a church anymore? Is that even possible? Is that even a thing? And so the more that I looked into it, I realized that the vast majority of pastors in the world are not paid for what they do. In countries where Christianity is outlawed, the default is unpaid volunteer pastors. And so my picture of what a pastor was, this person with a great salary and benefits, standing on a big platform in front of a big church, that's extremely limited. I had based what a pastor should be on the pictures of the pastors I had seen in these, affluent communities across this country in America. But there was another way of doing it. And surprisingly, I found an ally with the Apostle Paul himself. If there was ever someone who refused to be paid as a pastor, it was Paul. And he did it for reasons different than the ones that I mentioned. I'm going to read to you just a couple of verses from his letter to the Corinthian church. Let me pull these up. First, what Paul says is he starts by making the case that he has every right to make a living from spreading the gospel. Okay, so that's where we're going to start. This is what he says. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple, sorry, that's the wrong slide. Let's go back a couple. There we go. Whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. He's using a metaphor of farmers. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? Meaning, if we pastor you and help you through all this, shouldn't we be able to get paid for it? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? Because Paul's saying they've done a lot. Him and the other apostles have done a lot. He's saying this is hard work and we deserve to be paid for it. But then he goes on. He says this, but we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Let me read that again. We put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. See, he's saying it's not bad for a pastor to be paid, but then he goes on and he says, but I, Paul, have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. Paul says he would rather die than be paid. And he goes on, he says this, or maybe that was the last slide. He says, I'll read the last part of it. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Paul says he'd rather die than take a salary. He says other pastors, they've got the right to be paid, but he would never do this himself because he doesn't want to do anything to hinder people from hearing the gospel. You're probably not going to hear that message at church conferences. You're not going to hear a lot of people talking about that, but it is in the Bible. And I think it's very applicable in our time today. In the year 2021 that we're in right now, people are very distrustful of big institutions. And this basically includes all big institutions. We see research that says people are really distrustful of across the board, anything that's longstanding institutions. But that doesn't disclude religious institutions like large or small, longstanding churches. And so even though I was working for this church that I believe was a faithful church, a good church, I don't think it was like a toxic church that we have talked about. And it had been around for like 30 plus years. Even though I was working for this church that I think was really good, my ability and our ability for dotChurch as a community to speak as openly and plainly about all these issues would always be hindered. There would always be the looming fear. And I didn't even feel this like from the people that I worked for, but I always felt this from being a part of this environment. And I'm not blaming this on the church leadership. It's just, I'm telling you, it's endemic in the system itself. There was always a fear that if we went too far or brought up something too, you know, I can't think of a good enough word, like too crazy or explosive, that we could upset some of the big givers, that people might pull their giving and then things would get bad. And like I said, I did not feel that pressure from the staff, but I felt it from the environment of how all churches operate. And so not only that, there's also people that I talk to who I would say, you should come be a part of dotChurch. And they would say, well, aren't you guys attached to that bigger church? And we'd say, yes. And they would say, I don't want to come on, because they had been so burned by the church in general that they would not come to even dotChurch knowing that it was attached to a larger church. Many of you on this call, maybe you didn't even know that dotChurch was connected to a larger church, and that was intentional. I would talk a lot with the lead pastor, and we both tried to keep it on the down low because we wanted to shield it from getting too much attention so that we could keep functioning and talking about these things without feeling this pressure of people saying, well, what are you talking about? You talked about what in church? But I wanted to be able to do this type of ministry in the open. Now, the church that we were a part of, they're reaching a large group of people who would literally never come to dotChurch. And dotChurch is a place for people who would never go there. And so like Paul says, I wanted to do everything that I could so that the gospel would go forth in both of these environments. And so over time, it became more and more clear that we probably would have to part ways. And I had no idea how this would even be possible. Like I said, I've only ever worked for churches, but I feel like God actually provided a way for me to do this. Randomly, an old former coworker of mine alerted me of this position at this company that was open, and I was actually able to take the job. And so as of a few weeks ago, dotChurch became fully independent, and it's fully volunteer run. And this is the part, when someone talks about, hey, this is this new thing that we started, we're on our own now, where the person starts to ask everyone to give money. But I'm going to be clear with you, I don't want your money. If we ever ask anyone to give money to dotChurch, it would only be to help someone in the community who is struggling, or to give directly to a nonprofit doing good work in the world. Or we maybe would ask people, hey, would you be willing to pay for some of the services that allow dotChurch to actually happen? Let me give you an example. We have a couple who pays for this Zoom webinar that we're in right now. A couple of dotChurch, they pay for this. We have another guy who pays for Canva, which when you see our Instagram posts, all that graphic design is from this website called Canva. And we have another couple who pays for the email service where you get the invite each week. Someone else pays for the website hosting service. But outside of things like this, none of the money that would ever be connected with dotChurch will go into the leaders' pockets. I can say this with 100% integrity, and all the other leaders on as well. We are not doing this because we want your money. We are doing this because we want to help you know Jesus. We are doing this because we know that deconstruction can be an incredibly scary place, and that it often is something that's almost impossible to speak about with other Christians in a normal church community. And so we're doing dotChurch to give you a space to wrestle and struggle with other Christians and people who don't even believe. And hopefully that we can help you in this process to reconstruct your faith. This reconstructed faith, though, will be a faith that has been hardened by working through the doubts, hardened by the realities that most Christians are too afraid to face openly. Because a hardened faith is actually a strong faith. It's a resilient faith. It's a faith that isn't easily shaken. I want to be clear. dotChurch, I'm not saying it's not the end all be all solution to the church's problems. We're going to fail in many ways. If you stay with dotChurch, we're going to fail you. There's going to be weeks where you don't like the speakers, where the topics don't resonate, where your small group discussion isn't that great. Someone in your small group may say something very offensive to you. It's messy. We're going to mess this up, but that is okay because dotChurch is not the point. I'm not the point. The other leaders are not the point. Jesus is the point. People will always fail, but Jesus never will. And we're just humbled that God has given us this opportunity to be involved in his work in any capacity. Now, I'm sure that you have lots of questions. I'm actually going to invite on one of the OG dotChurch founders, Emma Phillips, and we're going to try to talk through some of the more nitty-gritty parts of questions related to this and take any questions that you might have, because I'm sure that people will have questions from things that I've said. I didn't answer all those questions, and so this is kind of the chance to dive into them. And one thing to say as before we jump in, when you're chatting comments and things like that, if you ask questions, we would say, please put them in the Q&A spot, because that'll keep them all so we can see a good list. Because when everyone's chatting, it's hard for me and Emma to keep track what questions are coming in and what are comments. We'll try to reference the chat as we're going, but please put actual specific questions in the Q&A spot. That's one of the cool things about webinar. You can actually ask questions anonymously. So Emma, I told you to say that stuff, but I beat you to the punch. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll take some questions.
No, thank you. Please know that I'm now going to introduce myself as OG dotChurch founder to just everyone, because I feel like that's an amazing title. But yes, this is crazy. This is cool that we're here and now, a year later from the very start of dotChurch. So let's just get into it. I want to know, because I'm all about the drama. How did the church take you leaving? Was there bad blood? Was it awkward for you to kind of break ties, especially taking dotChurch with you?
Yeah, it actually was not. It was really seamless. I had been my boss is a guy named Anson. Love Anson to death. Loved working for him, and we had talked for probably 6 months. Does this make sense for dotChurch to be a part of? The larger church was called Christchurch, Illinois. And so we used to say, does this make sense? And we wrestled through, maybe it could be separate. And we kept trying all these different arrangements, and we could never find anything that really worked. And so by the end, when we said, okay, we're going to spin off, we're going to do this differently, nobody was surprised. We had talked through it, and we said, yeah, this really makes sense. And we were kind of bummed that we didn't figure out a solution to have it all be under one umbrella. But I think it actually opens up a lot of opportunities. And I have stayed in contact with the people that I've worked with. Like I said, this is my home church. I got married in this church. I met my wife in this church. Really just very formational in so many different ways. And so I have so much respect for the leadership team there. So there's no bad blood. If people move to Lake County, Illinois, and you're like, what church should I go to on a Sunday morning? I'll probably recommend you go to Christchurch, because I still really like it. I love it. I love the people there. So yeah, I'm so thankful that it was not a bad breakup or something, because there's a lot of cases where that can happen in churches.
Okay, well, I guess that's good to know. With that said, though, you said you would recommend Christchurch on Sundays. dotChurch is a church service of sorts. So should this replace what we do on Sunday mornings?
Yeah, great question. So as of now, dotChurch in its fully online form, I would not call it a church. I would say that right now we're kind of like a ministry, or you could call it, this is another vernacular, a para-church ministry. It kind of comes alongside of a church. And so there are many of you here who have no interest in going back to a church because of what you've been through and what the churches have done. And so I would say that is totally fine. Stay just a part of dotChurch. Let this be your community. The hope is that we can get people to a place where they say, listen, I've wrestled through these doubts, and I'm ready to go back into a church as an agent for good, an agent for change. So I'm hoping that people, at some point will get to the place where they're strong enough in their own, have wrestled through the doubts. Like I said, have that strong, hardened faith where they can say, I'm going to go back into a church, maybe not the one that I grew up in, maybe a different one, maybe it's a different denomination or something, but I'm going to step back in and I'm going to re-engage. And so, and try to help make it as healthy and Jesus-centered as possible. I'm going to take the things that I learned as being part of a dotChurch and do that. But I also want to say that some people, dotChurch may be an ongoing thing for you for years. Your community, we know a lot of these small groups are forming actual real community and having real conversations and really supporting each other. And so that's never going to go away if you don't want it to. If your group wants to meet for the next 10 years, that's great. More power to you.
Definitely. Yeah. So we talk a lot about deconstruction, and I know you pretty well, but there might be a lot of people on here who don't. Why do you think that you are able to speak to people who are deconstructing?
Yeah.
What are your credentials?
I don't know if I have credentials, but I think I have thought a lot about a lot of these things, and I have some close friends. Most of my close friends, my closest of friends, the whole group, none of them are Christians. And so I know that some people, when they become Christians, they kind of get into Christian bubbles, and they're only around other Christians. And so the longer that you're away from people who aren't Christians, you sort of forget what they think and their objections with the church. And so just being really close friends, I have a friend named Michael, I have a friend named Dan, and a couple other people that I literally talk to on a daily basis. And they're no interest in Christianity. And so they've like said, I don't want to be a part of a church because of X, Y, and Z. And then there's other people that I'm close with who also have left churches. And so I think it's really relationship based. And also my dad has been a really big influence. He's very we've had him on here before talk about his own story. And so he went through a big period of deconstruction. And so we've wrestled through a ton of different things. And I think I just trust Jesus. And at one point I learned that the word faith in Jesus, put your faith in Jesus. I heard a different interpretation that was said that you could probably understand that as allegiance, that your allegiance is to Jesus, but that might mean that your intellectual beliefs can be all over the place, that what you're actually doing can be all over the place. And so for me, realigning it as allegiance has allowed me to be able to doubt and be able to wrestle and be able to be okay with that and not think, well, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore because maybe my views have flipped on this or my views have flipped on that.
Definitely. So we're a year in and a lot has happened within dotChurch. A lot has changed, a lot has grown. What are we looking at for the next year that is dotChurch?
Yeah. So I have a couple loose ideas of things that we want to, and we've talked through these, Emma and other people on the leadership team have talked through these things. We really want to become an incorporated 501c3 so that we actually have a structure in place. To be a 501c3, I'm pretty sure that you need a board of directors of some kind who are outside partners, who have who are not actually part of the ministry. And so I have no interest in being a floating island where we can do whatever we want and have no accountability. I want to have people holding us accountable. And like I said, like if any of the people of dotChurch have some sort of moral failings or something goes wrong, we want to be a place that we can actually say, we're going to help you work through this and have a process of restoration. And so getting those accountability structures in place will be a big goal of the next year. We've also talked about doing some things in person as COVID is hopefully ending, as more people get the vaccine, as more people feel comfortable going out, doing something in person, starting some actual physical dotChurch spaces. Mm-hmm. So those are really the two main goals. And then just continuing to be a place where we can wrestle through deconstruction, continue to facilitate that process of moving through deconstruction towards reconstruction. And so that's very vague, but we're trying some more things that we'll probably talk about in the next couple of weeks or months.
Definitely. Awesome. I want to hit some of these questions that people have sent in because they're actually really good. They're better than my questions. So we're going to go here. All right. Anthony, can you explain how you manage your time now that dotChurch is no longer your full-time job? I feel like working at a tech company and leading dotChurch can be a lot of a burden on you.
Thank you, anonymous attendee, for asking. What a thoughtful question. Yes, it is definitely reduced my ability of time to be able to work on dotChurch specifically. So really, I want to take a all hands on deck. Is that the phrase? Mm-hmm. Whatever that phrase, right? Like an all hands on deck.
All hands approach. On deck. Takes a village.
Takes a village, all that stuff. We always have talked about how the church, we get it wrong when we think the church is, well, that's what the pastor does and that's what the staff does. The church is really what we all do. It's a community. It's everyone has gifts that they bring to the table. And so being a pastor, you have to ask people to do things a lot of times for free. And it always can feel a little bit like if you're the pastor, you're like, hey, can you do this thing for free? And they're like, well, like you get paid. Why can't I get paid? But now you can't even say that anymore. Now we're all doing it for free. So if you have skills and talents and abilities that you would like to help dotChurch with, feel free to just send me an email. I'll put in the chat. We have all sorts of needs. We have needs for, here's my email coming at you. I'm dropping it in. We have needs writing, graphic design, social media related, administrative related, lots of like back end upkeep of things, really anything, any skills that you're like, hey, I want to serve at dotChurch in some capacity. If you just send me an email and say, hey, I can do this, I guarantee that there'll be a way for it to really support the mission of dotChurch.
Awesome. Definitely. I love this question. And I think it'll speak to a lot of people here. You scrolled away. Can people in this group be struggling in their faith and really basic in their faith? This questioner says, I want to learn more, but I feel pretty hurt.
100%. I think this is literally the ideal place to do that. This would be the place where we learn more, We wrestle through it, and we don't have to be afraid of saying something that's going to get you kicked out. If
Mhm.
you've noticed, if you go on dotChurch's website or on the Instagram, we don't actually have a defined statement of belief. Here's the 10 things that dotChurch believes and you must believe. That's on purpose. That's by design. Because there's a book, it's called A Flexible Faith. I might have mentioned it a couple weeks ago, but it basically, a lot of churches, and this is not to knock them, a lot of churches will say, hey, here's the 10 ways to interpret the Bible. This is how you're supposed to think about this, this, and this. But if you look at the broad scope of history of Christianity, that's not always been the case. Most of these issues have 2 or 3 different ideas, like 2 or 3 different theological ways of understanding them. And so we don't actually say you have to be a Calvinist to be a part of dotChurch, or you have to be an Arminian to be a part of dotChurch, or you have to believe this about baptism, or you have to believe this about X, Y, or Z. So we say this is the place to wrestle through it. And we actually do want diversity of thought. We want people to come in from different traditions, because I think that's what gets us sharper. I trust you all on this call and think that you're adults and you can hear ideas that are different than what you grew up with. And that's okay. And I'm not afraid that you're going to get brought down some crazy path. You're going to hear about the ideas probably one way or the other. So I'd rather you hear them in this context where we can actually talk about them versus hearing them in some place completely devoid of anyone who's actually a part of Christianity. And that's usually where these things get talked about, as they say, well, this, you never knew this. But this is the place to talk about those things.
Definitely. All right. I want to combine these next two because I think they go well together. Is dotChurch the only church you attend? And then does your wife, and I'll rephrase this, and future children, will they go to dotChurch?
Yes, we have no children. At this point, we have a dog. She's kind of like a child. I know people get really upset with that who have human children, because it's not the same. And I am not saying it's the same, but we like our dog. But yeah, we currently are trying to figure out where we're going to land, what church we're going to go to. So we have not figured that out yet. We've been trying a lot of different churches around us, some in the surrounding neighborhoods, but we do plan to go to a church somewhere.
Awesome. This is a good one. What do you suggest for people on here who don't go to church and therefore don't, in quotes, tithe? How might they go about practicing generosity? And do you have any specific examples?
Great question, anonymous attendee. I hope the anonymous attendee is the same person asking us all these just fire questions. We got one amazing question asker. I think generosity can look a lot of different ways. I don't think it has to look one way of like, I write down 10% of my income and give it to a church, and that's the only way I can practice it. So I think, like, with your friend groups or with people that you're close to, if someone's struggling financially, sending them money on Venmo directly goes a long way. If you have neighbors who are like really struggling, helping support them financially, that's really big. If there's things in dotChurch that you want to support financially, like some of those things we talked about, like these administrative costs, like most likely when we go through the process of becoming a 501c3, we're gonna have to pay for like a lawyer to work through all that. So like that's going to be a big chunk of money. So hopefully we can all kind of come up with the money to do that together. So that's an example. But yeah, tithing, it's a good biblical principle. I don't think it's the end all be all. I don't think it applies in every case. And I think there's times where you're not tithing and that's okay. And you can be more generous. Like my mom, for example, she takes people out to lunch all the time. She takes people to get their hair cut, to get their nails done. And she says it's like her ministry. She wants to help people and support them. I think she calls it something therapy. It's like a aromatherapy or self. I can't remember. She could put it in the chat if she remembers.
Retail therapy.
Retail therapy. That's what it is. Retail therapy. Helping people through their problems by buying them things.
Yes. Thank you, Sabrina. And I do like this next question too, because we talk a lot about sort of we discuss this, but on dotChurch, sometimes we tend to focus on the negative. So maybe let's take a look at some positives. You talked about the disadvantages of having paid leadership/pastors, but what are the advantages, if there are any?
Yep.
Again,
yep. There are advantages. My brother is a lead pastor of a church down in Kentucky, and the culture is very different there. So it's not like the stigma around churches is not so acute. And so it's just like a different type of environment than where we are. And he's able to devote 40, 50, 60 hours a week sometimes to leading this church. And churches, so I've said this in the past, and I've not done a good enough job of saying this. sometimes we can say, look at these big mega churches, how terrible they are. Sometimes that's true, but mega churches can do things that small churches cannot do. They can build hospitals, they can build schools, they can do like massive renovations of whole cities, things that just churches with smaller amounts of money can't do. Like we talked about Willow Creek the other week, and there was a lot of stuff that went down at Willow Creek that was pretty messed up. But Willow Creek has like an outward facing organization, and I can't remember the name of it. My sister Katie, if she's on, she could put it in the chat. She said that, yeah, they're also great places to give in your, I think this is Kate, my sister, food pantries, homeless ministries. Kate, if you could add in what the Willow thing is called, the Care Center, that's it. So the Willow Care Center can do and does amazing things, and it's only possible because they have so much financial resources. Mm-hmm. So having pastors who are devoted to it, like Paul says pastors deserve to get paid. So I don't want you to hear that I think that's wrong or that they don't deserve to get paid, but in some cases, it just doesn't necessarily make sense. And there are some instances where, like, if Paul says that, in America, that feels like it's the exception. You don't really hear that talked about very often in conferences and things like that. But it should be much more prevalent of pastors who are just leading while they do, like tent making is the Christian-y term, because Paul made his money by making tents. So he traveled around, he made tents, and then he preached. So.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I don't want to skip questions, but there's just so many good ones. And some of them can be answered with others. Let's go to, you can just answer this quickly. Anthony, would you say you're making church great again? That's anonymous attendee for you.
I'm not gonna respond. That's great. Thank you for that. We're gonna move on from there.
All right. How will you go about selecting the board of trustees in a way that doesn't make it seem like all the direction or decision-making power is kept behind closed doors? I feel like a lot of church pain comes from people in power making decisions that nobody has any say in.
My answer is I don't know how to build a board, but I am aware, and I hate all those things. I hate when it's secret. No one knows who the elder board is. They do all this stuff in the shadows. And a lot of times they're just like people who are just like, yes men. And I say men because it's a lot of times in churches it is men. So I have no plans in creating an army of Anthony supporters. So I don't actually know the best practices, but I'm going to look into those best practices and do them. So hopefully that answers the question.
Awesome. This is a great one. Kirsten, how do you plan to keep those who are not near a part of dotChurch as y'all move forward in meeting in person?
So dotChurch is an online centric ministry. It started that way, and that will always be the main focus. So I've given the example, like we've talked about making ways where there can be small groups of people who all gather together in a house, in some sort of space where they Zoom in together, and then they have small groups in person. But that actually won't affect necessarily what's happening on like as part of the ministry. So like, for example, even in this webinar format, we got all these questions coming in. We got a lot of stuff coming in the chat. There's a good sense of that. And then we're going to go to our small groups. Some of the people watching could be groups of 10, 15, 20 people, but that doesn't actually change anything. So we're really just going to be saying, can we encourage people where they are to see if there's communities that can come together so that they can do this not only just online, but in person. But it will always be an online centric ministry that may eventually have physical components, but it's not going to flip and be now we're one giant massive building and the online becomes a side part of it.
Yeah, awesome. I think this is a good closing one. Why does it feel like what you're doing, and by that leading a church for free under principles that actually mirror the Bible, seems so rogue or radical? If we as Christians are supposed to model Christ, why does it seem like you and dotChurch are one of the few out there?
So I would not say that I'm one of the few. There's a lot of people, they just don't get as much press. They're not the ones, because usually what you see when you think of the church, you see people who have really big platforms. You see people who have built massive churches, have really large social media followings. But there are many people out there who have been doing this faithfully, leading bivocationally for years and years since before I was born. So I am not trying to say I have come up with some revolutionary thing. There's actually a large trend. I was just reading about it today. there's a large trend of pastors who are doing this exact same thing as me. And so people are saying maybe this is like a new wave of bivocational pastors, but no, it is not new. And I think it seems so radical because of the way church operates in America. Church in America, in the Western context, has become very like a business. It's like a big business. I mean, if you talked about the money that involves with Christian music and everything, it's millions, if not hundreds of millions. I don't know much about money, so I'm just going to throw out big numbers. It's bazillions of dollars. There's other people in here who could give actual statistics.
Sounds right.
I've reached the end of my credibility in speaking into that.
I love it. Okay, then I guess we'll close with this because you answered a lot quicker than I thought. What has been the hardest part of building dotChurch?
Yeah, I mean, we started during the pandemic, so we're just figuring it out as we go along. This is not some master plan. We're trying to listen to God's leading. We're trying to follow what we feel like the Holy Spirit is guiding us to do. But yeah, just figuring out what to do, what not to do has been such a process. And I don't think we've cracked the code or something. And it's been so helpful to have the team of people that we have on dotChurch's, just the set of leaders that we have. It's just an amazing group of people. So many people who help behind the scenes has made it possible. But yeah, I think that's probably just the huge amounts of unknowns that we and every other church in America have been dealing with for the last, year or more has made it really tricky.